The day I received a $300 fine for my heat pump being visible from the street was the day I decided that peaceful compliance had officially ended. I am Jacob Sinclair, and I have lived in the Pleasant Grove subdivision of Columbus, Ohio, for exactly 7 years. During those 7 years, I paid my HOA dues on time, kept my lawn trimmed to regulation height, and painted my house only in approved colors from their ridiculously limited palette. I followed every single rule, even the ones that made absolutely no sense. But this fine crossed a line I did not even know existed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February. The envelope bore the Pleasant Grove Homeowners Association logo, which always made my stomach clench a bit. Nothing good ever came in those envelopes. I opened it while standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, expecting maybe a notice about the annual meeting or a reminder about trash placement. Instead, I found a violation notice with a fine attached. "Dear Mr. Sinclair," it read in that overly formal tone that screamed bureaucratic nonsense. "It has come to our attention that your recently installed heating system unit is visible from the street and violates Section 4.7.2 of the Pleasant Grove Community Standards, which states that all mechanical equipment including but not limited to air conditioning units, heat pumps, and utility boxes must be screened from view or located in areas not visible from common areas or neighboring properties. You have 15 days to remedy this violation or face escalating fines. Initial fine, $300. I read it 3 times. My heat pump, the one I had installed just 6 weeks ago after my ancient furnace finally gave up the ghost in the middle of a snowstorm. The one that cost me $8,000 to purchase and install. The one that was saving me nearly 40% on my heating bills. That heat pump. I walked outside and stared at the unit sitting on a concrete pad on the side of my house. It was not an eyesore. It was not bright pink or covered in graffiti. It was a standard beige heat pump that blended perfectly well with my house's siding. Sure, you could see it from the street if you were specifically looking for it, but it was hardly the neighborhood blight they were making it out to be. My neighbor, Paul, was out getting his mail. I waved him over. "Did you get one of these?" I asked, showing him the letter. Paul squinted at it, his reading glasses perched on his head where they were completely useless. "A fine for what?" "My heat pump. They say it is visible from the street." Paul actually laughed. "You are kidding me, that little thing, I barely notice it. Apparently someone did, and that someone reported it to the HOA. "Let me guess," Paul said, his voice dropping. "Brenda. Brenda Morrison, of course." The 47-year-old self-appointed guardian of Pleasant Grove's aesthetic standards and current HOA board president. She had moved into the neighborhood about 4 years ago and immediately started volunteering for every committee, every project, every opportunity to stick her nose into other people's business. Within 2 years, she had maneuvered herself into the presidency, and our once reasonable HOA had transformed into a tyrannical organization that seemed to exist solely to make everyone's life miserable. Brenda drove a white Lexus SUV that she washed every 3 days. Her blonde hair was always styled in that particular way that required both expensive products and a complete lack of personality. She wore athleisure clothing despite never actually exercising, and her smile had all the warmth of a corporate lawsuit. "I am going to talk to her," I said. Paul grimaced. "Good luck with that, man. She does not do reasonable." I knew he was right, but I had to try. I walked 3 houses down to Brenda's immaculate 2-story colonial with its perfectly edged lawn and symmetrical landscaping that looked like it had been installed by robots. I rang the doorbell, which played some pretentious classical tune. Brenda opened the door wearing cream-colored leggings and a tunic top, holding a wine glass at 2 in the afternoon. "Jacob, what can I do for you?" "I got this fine," I said, holding up the letter. "About my heat pump?" "Oh, yes." She took a sip of her wine, not inviting me in. "That was brought to the board's attention last week." "Brought to the board's attention by whom?" "That is confidential." "Brenda, my heat pump is barely visible. It is on the side of my house and it is beige. It matches everything." "The rules are very clear, Jacob. All mechanical equipment must be screened from view. It is in the bylaws." She said bylaws like it was a sacred text. "I just spent $8,000 on this system. I cannot afford to build some elaborate screening structure right now." "That sounds like a planning issue on your part. You should have consulted the Architectural Review Committee before installation." "It was an emergency replacement. My furnace died in the middle of winter. I had to act fast." Brenda's expression did not change. "Then you should have ensured your contractor was familiar with our community standards. The fine stands. You have 15 days. She started to close the door. "Brenda, this is unreasonable." "What is unreasonable is expecting special treatment because you did not do your due diligence." "Good day, Jacob." The door closed. I stood there for a moment, blood pressure rising, trying to decide between walking away or ringing the doorbell again. I chose the mature option and walked away, though every step felt like swallowing glass. Back home, I did what any rational person would do in 2025. I went online and started researching. I pulled up the Pleasant Grove HOA bylaws, all 97 pages of them, and found section 4.7.2. Brenda was technically correct. The rule did state that mechanical equipment should be screened. But as I read further, I found something interesting. The rule also included an exemption clause for situations where screening would be architecturally impractical or cost prohibitive, exceeding 20% of the original installation cost. A screening structure would cost me at least $2,000, which was exactly 25% of my heat pump installation cost. That fell directly into the exemption category. I called an emergency meeting request with the HOA board. According to the bylaws, they had to grant me a hearing within 10 business days. They scheduled it for the following Tuesday evening at the community center, which was just a fancy name for a glorified meeting room in the subdivision's entrance area. I spent the next week preparing. I printed out the relevant bylaw sections, got 3 quotes from contractors for screening structures, documented my heat pump installation costs, took photographs from various angles showing just how non-intrusive the unit was, and even got a petition signed by 15 neighbors stating they had no problem with my heat pump's visibility. The night of the meeting, I arrived 15 minutes early. The community center was a sterile room with fluorescent lighting, folding tables arranged in a U-shape, and that peculiar smell of stale coffee and disappointment that seemed universal to HOA meetings. The board consisted of 5 members. Brenda sat in the center, naturally. To her right was Tom Richards, a retired accountant who mostly nodded along with whatever Brenda said. To her left was Patricia Chen, who actually seemed reasonable but rarely spoke up. The other 2 members were Harold Davison, who owned 3 properties in the subdivision and treated HOA meetings like board meetings for his personal real estate empire, and Jennifer Walsh, a newer member who was clearly still figuring out the political dynamics. About 8 other residents attended, including Paul, who gave me a supportive nod. Brenda called the meeting to order with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. They went through standard business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing lawn maintenance contracts, debating whether the entrance fountain needed repairs. Then came Agenda Item 7, My appeal. Jacob Sinclair has requested a hearing regarding Violation Notice 2025-087 concerning an unscreened heat pump unit, Brenda announced in her most official voice. Mr. Sinclair, you have 10 minutes to present your case. I stood, suddenly aware of how much this felt like being on trial. Thank you. As you all know, I installed a heat pump in January after my furnace failed. I understand there was concern about its visibility from the street. However, I am appealing this fine based on several factors. I laid out my printed materials on the table. First, the heat pump is positioned on the side of my house in the only location where installation was practical due to electrical and mechanical requirements. Second, while it is technically visible from the street, it is minimally intrusive and matches my home's exterior. I have photographs showing the sight lines. I showed the pictures. From the street, you had to actually stop and look for the unit to notice it. It was not like it was sitting in my front yard. Third, and most importantly, I am requesting an exemption under Section 4.7.3 of the bylaws, which allows for exemptions when screening costs exceed 20% of the original installation cost. My heat pump cost $8,000 to install. The 3 quotes I have received for appropriate screening structures range from $2,000 to $2,500, which is 25 to 31% of my installation cost. I distributed copies of the contractor quotes and my installation invoice. Finally, I have a petition signed by 15 households in our immediate area stating that they have no objection to my heat pump's current placement. I handed over the petition and sat down. I thought I had made a solid case. The exemption clause was right there in black and white. Brenda barely glanced at my materials. The board will now deliberate. Mr. Sinclair, please wait outside. I was dismissed like a child sent to the principal's office. I stood in the hallway with Paul, who had followed me out. You nailed it, Paul said. That exemption clause is clear as day. Thanks, I just hope they actually read it. We waited for 20 minutes. Finally, Jennifer Walsh opened the door and called me back in. Brenda cleared her throat. The board has reviewed your appeal. While we acknowledge your citation of Section 4.7.3, we have determined that the exemption does not apply in this case. The rule requires that screening be architecturally impractical, which is not the situation here. Cost alone is insufficient for exemption. The fine stands. You now have 8 days remaining to comply. I felt my jaw drop. That is not what the rule says. It clearly states architecturally impractical or cost prohibitive, though means they are separate criteria. The board interprets or as clarifying language. Both conditions must be met. That makes no grammatical sense. That is our interpretation. This hearing is concluded. I looked at the other board members. Tom was nodding. Harold looked bored. Patricia would not meet my eyes. Only Jennifer looked uncomfortable. This is absurd, I said, trying to keep my voice level. You are deliberately misinterpreting your own rules. Mr. Sinclair, if you continue to be disruptive, we will have to ask you to leave, Brenda said coldly. Paul grabbed my arm. Come on, man, this is not worth it. Outside, I was shaking with anger. They did not even consider my evidence. They made up their minds before I walked in. Of course they did, Paul said. Brenda runs this board like her personal fiefdom. Logic does not apply. I drove home and spent the next 3 hours researching Ohio HOA law. I learned several interesting things. First, HOAs in Ohio had significant power, but they were still bound by their own governing documents. They could not arbitrarily reinterpret their bylaws. Second, homeowners had the right to dispute fines in court if they believed the HOA was acting outside its authority. Third, and most interestingly, HOAs could face legal consequences for selective enforcement or bad faith interpretations of their rules. I decided I was not paying the fine. Let them escalate. I would see them in court if necessary. The next letter arrived a week later. The fine had increased to $500, and I was now facing additional penalties of $50 per day until compliance. They had also sent a formal notice that my account was delinquent and that they were placing a lien on my property. A lien on my house for a beige heat pump. I called my lawyer friend, Marcus, who did not specialize in HOA law but knew enough to point me in the right direction. Document everything, he advised. Every communication, every fine notice, every interaction. If this goes to court, you want a paper trail showing their unreasonableness. Should I just pay the fine and be done with it? That is up to you, man. But if you pay, you are admitting they are right, and they will keep doing this to you and everyone else. Sometimes you have to take a stand. Marcus was right. This was not really about the money anymore. This was about Brenda and her board wielding power without accountability. Then I had an idea. If they wanted to make my heat pump a neighborhood issue, I would make it a neighborhood talking point. I started by putting a small sign in my yard, nothing offensive or inflammatory. Just a simple white sign with black lettering. Ask me about my heat pump. Within a day, 3 neighbors stopped by asking what it was about. I explained the situation. They were all sympathetic and outraged on my behalf. Word spread. Next, I created a Facebook group called Pleasant Grove Homeowner Information Exchange. I posted my entire story, including photographs of the violation notices, the bylaw sections, my exemption evidence, and the board's denial. I invited every Pleasant Grove resident I could find. The group grew quickly. 50 members by the end of the first day, 100 by the end of the week. People started sharing their own HOA horror stories. Someone had been fined for having their garage door open too long. Another homeowner was cited for having the wrong shade of white trim paint. A couple had been threatened with legal action because their mailbox was 3 inches too tall. The common thread in every story was Brenda. She was either directly involved or had empowered the Architectural Review Committee to be even more pedantic than necessary. My "Ask Me About My Heat Pump" sign generated so much foot traffic that I decided to escalate. I made it bigger. I made it colorful. I added lights. My new sign was 4 feet tall and professionally made. It featured a high-quality photograph of my heat pump with the caption, "This heat pump, $300 fine. Your HOA dues at work," with arrow pointing toward the actual unit. I put solar-powered spotlights on it so it was visible at night. Brenda was at my door the next morning. She did not ring the doorbell. She pounded. I opened the door. "Good morning, Brenda." "That sign is a violation," she said, her face red. "Take it down immediately." Actually, according to Section 8.3 of the bylaws, homeowners are allowed 1 non-commercial sign up to 6 square feet. My sign is exactly 5.8 square feet. I measured carefully. It is inflammatory and violates community standards. It is informative. I am just helping my neighbors understand how their HOA operates. Jacob, I am warning you. Warning me of what? More fines. Go ahead. I am not paying those either. She turned and stormed off, her designer sneakers slapping against my walkway. The next HOA board meeting was 3 weeks away, and it became the most anticipated event in Pleasant Grove history. My Facebook group had grown to over 200 members, which was significant since the entire subdivision only had about 400 homes. People were comparing stories, organizing, and demanding accountability. I kept my sign up. I added another element. Every few days I would update it with a new fact. Day 15 of heat pump visibility, still no property value collapse. Or the heat pump, quietly doing its job despite controversy. Or my personal favorite, this heat pump is more efficient than your HOA board. People would slow down driving past my house to read whatever new update I had posted. Some took pictures. A few teenagers even made it an Instagram thing, posting selfies with my sign. Brenda sent me 3 more violation notices. One for the sign, which I disputed based on the bylaw I had cited. One for creating a disturbance, which was so vague it was legally meaningless. And one for bringing disrepute to the community, which was both hilarious and pathetic. I did not pay any of them. My lien situation was growing, but I did not care. I had already consulted with an actual HOA attorney by this point, a sharp woman named Rita Kaufman who had handled dozens of these cases. She reviewed my documentation and smiled. "They have messed up in about 6 different ways," she said. "Their interpretation of the exemption clause is indefensible. Their escalating fines without proper notice and hearing procedures violate Ohio Revised Code Section 5312. And their retaliatory violations for your sign are so obvious it is almost funny. If this goes to court, you will win. How much will it cost me? Couple thousand for the whole process. But when you win, they have to pay your legal fees. It is in your bylaws. So I could actually force them to pay for their own defeat." Exactly. I loved the law sometimes. The next board meeting finally arrived. The community center could not accommodate everyone who wanted to attend, so they moved it to the clubhouse, which had a larger meeting space. Over 100 residents showed up. The energy in the room was electric. Brenda looked nervous for the first time since I had known her. The other board members looked confused and uncomfortable. They clearly had not expected this level of turnout or attention. Brenda tried to start with normal business, but residents kept interrupting, demanding to discuss the enforcement practices. Finally, Harold made a motion to add community concerns about enforcement to the agenda, and it passed unanimously. One by one, residents stood up and shared their stories. A woman named Grace Graham talked about being fined $200 because her daughter had left a bicycle on the front lawn overnight. An elderly man described being threatened with legal action over a lawn ornament that was 2 inches too tall. A young couple explained how they had been denied permission to install solar panels, despite there being no specific rule against them. The common thread was Brenda. She was either signing off on all these violations or driving the committee to enforce rules that most people did not even know existed. Then it was my turn. I stood up with my folder of documentation. "I want to talk about accountability," I said. "This board has the power to fine us, place liens on our properties, and make our lives difficult. But who holds them accountable when they abuse that power?" I went through my case again, slowly and methodically. I explained the bylaw language, the exemption clause, the grammar, the logic. I showed the photos. I displayed the contractor quotes. I read the petition aloud, all 15 signatures. This board rejected all of this evidence because it does not fit their narrative. They misinterpreted their own rules, probably deliberately, and when I put up a sign to inform my neighbors about it, they tried to fine me for that too. I pulled out Brenda's violation notices. These are retaliatory. They are an attempt to silence criticism. And they represent exactly the kind of overreach that has made living in Pleasant Grove feel less like a community and more like living under surveillance. The room erupted in applause. Brenda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Patricia Chen, the normally quiet board member, spoke up. "I would like to make a motion to revisit Mr. Sinclair's exemption request with fresh eyes and no predetermined conclusions." Second, Jennifer Walsh said immediately, Brenda tried to maintain control. That is not proper procedure. We already ruled on his appeal. The bylaws allow for motions to reconsider within 90 days, Patricia said quietly. I looked it up. The motion passed 4-1 with only Brenda voting against it. The board agreed to review my case again at a special meeting in 1 week. I left that meeting feeling victorious, but I knew Brenda was not done. People like her did not give up power easily. Sure enough, 3 days later, I received a notice that the special meeting had been canceled due to scheduling conflicts. When I checked the Facebook group, other residents reported that Patricia Chen had been contacted by Brenda and pressured to withdraw her motion. That was when things got interesting. Patricia Chen joined my Facebook group and posted a long message explaining what had happened. Brenda had called her privately and suggested that if Patricia continued to cause problems, Brenda would ensure that Patricia's upcoming exterior repainting project would face endless delays and rejections from the Architectural Review Committee. It was a clear threat. Patricia's post went viral within the subdivision. People were outraged. Several residents filed formal complaints against Brenda with the board. Others started circulating recall petitions. In Ohio, HOA boards can be recalled through a vote of the membership if enough homeowners sign a petition. We needed signatures from 20% of the households to trigger a recall election. We got 30% in 5 days. Brenda tried to fight it. She sent out a mass email defending her actions, claiming she was just enforcing the rules and that a small group of malcontents was trying to undermine the HOA's authority. The email was tone-deaf and condescending, which only made more people angry. The recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. During that time, my heat pump sign became a symbol of resistance. Other homeowners started putting up their own signs. Ask me about my mailbox fine. Ask me about my garage door violation. Ask me about HOA overreach. It was beautiful. Brenda escalated her enforcement tactics, which was possibly the worst strategy she could have chosen. She had the Architectural Review Committee send out a mass inspection notice, threatening to personally review every property in Pleasant Grove for violations. It was an obvious intimidation tactic. It backfired spectacularly. Residents who had been neutral or uninterested suddenly became engaged and angry. The Facebook group grew to over 300 members. People who had never attended an HOA meeting in their lives were now organizing carpools to the recall election. I kept updating my sign. Week 8 of heat pump visibility, subdivision still standing. And my favorite, heat pump update, Brenda is still mad about it. My heat pump had become a minor celebrity. Someone made a Twitter account for it. A local news station even did a lighthearted story about the HOA heat pump controversy, which featured an interview with me explaining the situation. The reporter was clearly amused by the whole thing, and the story framed it as an example of HOA overreach, exactly as I had hoped. The publicity was not good for Brenda. The Pleasant Grove HOA suddenly had a reputation as being unreasonable and petty. Prospective homebuyers in the area started asking about the HOA's enforcement practices. Real estate agents began steering clients away from Pleasant Grove. Harold Davison, the board member with multiple properties, noticed the impact on property values and perceived desirability. He called me personally. "Jacob, this has gotten out of hand," he said. "I agree. Your board president has been on a power trip and it is damaging the community. I am not defending Brenda. I am saying we need to find a resolution before this hurts everyone's property values." The resolution is simple. Admit the heat pump exemption applies, rescind the fines, and stop the retaliatory enforcement. What about your sign? What about it? It is within the rules, but if the HOA shows some good faith, I might consider taking it down. Harold sighed. Let me talk to the other board members. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA board. It was not signed by Brenda, but by Patricia Chen as acting secretary. The letter stated that upon further review, the board had determined that my exemption request under Section 4.7.3 was valid, and that all fines related to the heat pump would be rescinded. The lien on my property would be removed. Additionally, the board apologized for the confusion and inconvenience. It was not everything I wanted. There was no admission of deliberate misinterpretation or acknowledgement of Brenda's intimidation tactics. But it was a win. I took down my heat pump sign and replaced it with a simple "Thank you, neighbors" sign. But I did not take down the Facebook group or stop organizing for the recall election. The recall vote took place on a rainy Saturday in April. The turnout was unprecedented. Over 70% of homeowners either voted in person or submitted absentee ballots. The results were decisive. Brenda Morrison was recalled by a vote of 312 to 89. Tom Richards, her loyal supporter, was also recalled. The other 3 board members survived their votes. Brenda showed up to the community center when the results were announced. She looked furious and defeated. She did not give a speech or make a statement. She just grabbed her belongings and left. New board elections were held 3 weeks later. Patricia Chen ran for president and won easily. 2 new members were elected who ran on platforms of reasonable enforcement and community engagement. The new board's first action was to establish a formal appeals process with neutral arbitration for disputed violations. Their second action was to review and revise the bylaws to eliminate ambiguous language and create clearer exemption criteria. The process took months and involved input from dozens of residents. The new bylaws were actually readable and reasonable. As for my heat pump, it continued to sit on the side of my house, quietly and efficiently heating and cooling my home while being barely visible from the street. Nobody complained about it. Nobody filed violations. It just existed as it should have from the beginning. But the story did not end there. About 2 months after the recall election, I received a subpoena. Brenda Morrison was suing me personally for defamation and harassment. She claimed my Facebook posts and my heat pump sign had damaged her reputation and caused her emotional distress. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I immediately called Rita Kaufman, my HOA attorney. "Is she serious?" I asked. "Unfortunately, yes. This is a SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. She is trying to punish you for speaking out. Can she win?" Absolutely not. Ohio has anti-SLAP laws that protect exactly this kind of speech. Everything you posted was factually true and a matter of public concern, but you still have to respond to the lawsuit, which costs time and money. That is the point. Rita filed a motion to dismiss under Ohio's anti-SLAP statute, arguing that my speech was protected and that Brenda's lawsuit was frivolous and retaliatory. She also filed a counterclaim seeking attorney fees and costs. The case went before a judge in Franklin County Court 4 months later. I had to take a day off work to attend. Brenda showed up with her own attorney, a stern-looking man who seemed deeply uninterested in the case. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Helen Martinez, reviewed the filings and heard brief arguments from both sides. Brenda's attorney argued that my Facebook posts and sign had been harassment, designed to humiliate his client, and that they went beyond legitimate criticism. Rita countered that everything I had posted was factually accurate, that I had a First Amendment right to discuss HOA governance, and that Brenda's lawsuit was a transparent attempt to silence legitimate criticism of her conduct as a public official within the HOA context. Judge Martinez asked Brenda's attorney a simple question. Can you point to a single false statement in any of Mr. Sinclair's posts or signage? The attorney flipped through his notes. The tone was inflammatory. That is not what I asked. Was anything false? Well, no, but the overall impression was accurate. That your client, as HOA president, issued fines that were later rescinded, and that residents found her enforcement practices unreasonable enough to recall her. Your Honor, the emotional impact is not defamation if the statements are true. Motion to dismiss is granted. Additionally, I am awarding attorney fees to Mr. Sinclair under Ohio's anti-SLAPP statute. Miss Morrison, I would strongly advise you to accept this outcome and move on. Continuing to pursue Mr. Sinclair will only make things worse for you. The gavel came down. The case was over. Outside the courtroom, Brenda walked past me without making eye contact. Her attorney looked relieved to be done with the case. Rita shook my hand. Congratulations. You just got paid to defend your right to criticize your HOA. The attorney fees award was $7,000, which more than covered Rita's costs and left me with a modest profit. But more importantly, it sent a message. You could not weaponize the legal system to silence legitimate criticism. News of the lawsuit dismissal and the attorney fees award spread through Pleasant Grove quickly. It became a cautionary tale about the limits of HOA authority and the importance of accountability. Brenda Morrison put her house on the market a month later. She moved out of Pleasant Grove that summer. I heard she relocated to a condo in Dublin where there was no HOA at all. The irony was not lost on anyone. Life in Pleasant Grove improved dramatically after the recall. The new board under Patricia Chen's leadership took a common-sense approach to enforcement. They focused on genuine issues like safety and maintenance rather than petty aesthetic violations. They established regular town halls where residents could voice concerns. They made the budget and meeting minutes easily accessible online. Most importantly, they revised the enforcement procedures to include multiple warnings before fines and a genuine appeals process with arbitration. The Architectural Review Committee was restructured to include term limits and community input. My heat pump became something of a legend in the subdivision. New residents would sometimes ask about the famous heat pump, and neighbors would tell them the whole story. It was a reminder that standing up to unreasonable authority was possible, and sometimes necessary. I stayed active in the Facebook group, which evolved from a complaint forum into a genuine community resource where people shared recommendations for contractors, organized neighborhood events, and kept tabs on HOA governance. The culture shifted from fear and compliance to engagement and cooperation. About a year after the whole ordeal, the new HOA board actually thanked me publicly at the annual meeting for helping to catalyze positive change in Pleasant Grove. They presented me with a tongue-in-cheek Community Service Award that featured a small picture of a heat pump. I gave a short speech about the importance of knowing your rights, reading the bylaws, and not being afraid to question authority when it overreaches. I talked about how HOAs are supposed to serve the community, not rule over it, and I emphasized that change is possible when people organize and work together. The applause was genuine and warm. It felt good to be recognized not as a troublemaker, but as someone who had stood up for principle. Paul, my neighbor who had supported me from the beginning, hosted a barbecue that summer to celebrate the one-year anniversary of Heat Pump Visibility Day, as we jokingly called it. About 30 neighbors showed up. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and told stories about the old days under Brenda's reign. Someone brought a cake decorated with a picture of my heat pump. We all laughed until we cried. As the evening wound down and people headed home, I stood in my backyard looking at the heat pump on the side of my house. It was just a machine, a metal box filled with refrigerant and compressors. But it had become a symbol of something larger, a reminder that even small acts of resistance can lead to meaningful change. The fines were gone. The lien was removed. The lawsuit was dismissed. The board was reformed. The community was stronger. And my heat pump continued to do exactly what it was designed to do, keeping my house comfortable while being barely visible from the street, finally at peace in its unassuming beige existence. I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that HOA bylaws are legal documents that must be followed even by the HOA itself. I learned that community organizing is powerful, and that people will stand together against injustice when given the opportunity. I learned that sometimes you have to fight battles that seem petty or small because they represent larger principles. Most importantly, I learned that you do not have to accept unreasonable treatment just because someone has a title or authority. HOA boards work for the homeowners, not the other way around. When they forget that, it is up to the community to remind them. The story could have ended badly. I could have paid the fine, built the screening structure, and quietly accepted the injustice. Brenda would have continued her authoritarian leadership. Other residents would have continued to suffer under arbitrary enforcement. The culture of fear would have persisted. But because I decided to fight back, because I used humor and community organizing rather than just anger, because I understood my rights and the rules, things changed for the better. Pleasant Grove became a more livable community where people were not afraid of their HOA. 2 years after the heat pump controversy, I was actually elected to the HOA board myself. I ran on a platform of transparency and reasonable enforcement, and I won easily. Serving on the board gave me even more appreciation for the complexity of managing a community, but it also reinforced my belief that common sense and fairness should guide decision-making. During my tenure, we simplified the bylaws even further, eliminating outdated and overly restrictive rules. We established a hardship exemption process for homeowners facing financial difficulties. We created a community improvement fund to help residents with major maintenance projects. And yes, we formally codified the heat pump exemption that had started the whole thing. Pleasant Grove became known in the Columbus area as an example of good HOA governance. Real estate agents started marketing it as a selling point. Property values recovered and even increased. People wanted to live in a community where the HOA was reasonable and responsive. I served one 3-year term on the board and then stepped down, satisfied that the culture had truly changed. Patricia Chen continued as president and did an excellent job maintaining the reforms and building on them. As for Brenda, I heard through the grapevine that she had tried to get involved in her condo association's management, but had been quickly voted out when other residents researched her history in Pleasant Grove. Her reputation preceded her, thanks to the local news coverage and online discussions. It turned out that people did not forget authoritarian behavior, and the internet had a long memory. I never felt vindictive about Brenda's situation. I actually felt a bit sad for her. She had let a small amount of power corrupt her judgment and turn her into someone who valued control over community. She had made her own choices, and those choices had consequences. My heat pump still runs efficiently, still sits on the side of my house, still is barely visible from the street. Every time I walk past it, I remember the whole crazy experience and smile. It is a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest changes. The Facebook group is still active with over 350 members now. We organize neighborhood events, share information about local issues, and keep an eye on HOA governance to ensure the reforms stick. The group has become a genuine community asset, connecting neighbors who might never have met otherwise. I made friends through the whole experience, people like Paul and Patricia and others who stood up when it mattered. We formed bonds based on shared values and mutual respect. The controversy brought the community together in a way that normal HOA activities never could. Looking back, I would not change anything. Getting that fine was frustrating and expensive, but it led to positive outcomes that benefited hundreds of families. It taught me about civic engagement, legal rights, and the power of humor in serious situations. It showed me that one person really can make a difference if they are willing to stand up and do the work. The heat pump sign is gone now, but I kept it in my garage as a memento. Sometimes I take it out and show it to visitors when they ask about the story. It always gets a laugh and usually leads to people sharing their own HOA horror stories. The whole experience also made me an amateur expert on HOA law and governance. People from other subdivisions started reaching out for advice when they faced similar situations. I helped several homeowners successfully appeal unfair fines and challenge arbitrary enforcement. I even gave a presentation at a local community meeting about homeowner rights and HOA accountability. It felt good to turn my negative experience into something helpful for others. Knowledge is power, especially when dealing with bureaucratic organizations that count on people not understanding the rules. My relationship with the Pleasant Grove HOA is now positive and constructive. I attend meetings when I can, volunteer for community events, and contribute to discussions about subdivision improvements. The difference between the old board under Brenda and the current board is night and day. We recently completed a playground renovation project that the old board had rejected as too expensive. The new board prioritized it, found creative funding solutions, and got it done. Kids are actually playing outside now, families are gathering at the park, and the community feels more alive. That is what an HOA should do. It should enhance community life, not police it. It should facilitate improvements, not obstruct them. It should bring people together, not divide them with arbitrary rules and enforcement. I still think HOAs have a place in residential communities. They can maintain common areas, organize services, and establish reasonable standards that protect property values. But they need oversight, accountability, and leadership that prioritizes service over control. The heat pump controversy taught me that these principles are worth fighting for. When an HOA loses sight of its purpose and becomes authoritarian, residents have not just the right but the responsibility to push back. Change is possible when people organize, document their cases, and refuse to be intimidated. 3 years after the fine that started everything, I refinanced my house to take advantage of lower interest rates. The title search came back clean, no liens or encumbrances. The heat pump lien that had once threatened my property was gone as if it had never existed. But the impact of fighting that lien, the changes it sparked, and the community it built, that remained. I invested some of the money I saved from refinancing into additional home improvements, all properly submitted to the Architectural Review Committee and all approved without hassle. The process was straightforward and reasonable, exactly as it should be, my heating and cooling bills remained low thanks to the efficient heat pump that had caused so much controversy. The system paid for itself within 5 years through energy savings, and it continued to perform flawlessly. Every time I felt the comfortable temperature in my house, I thought about how close I came to spending thousands of dollars on an unnecessary screening structure just to appease an unreasonable board. Standing up for what was right had saved me money, improved my community, and taught me valuable lessons about civic engagement and legal rights. It was a good return on investment for what started as a simple heating system replacement. As I write this, sitting in my comfortable living room warmed by my famous heat pump, I feel grateful for the whole experience. It was stressful and frustrating at times, but it was also empowering and ultimately rewarding. I learned that I could stand up to authority, that my neighbors would support me, and that positive change was possible even in the face of stubborn resistance. The heat pump quietly hums outside, doing its job without fanfare or controversy. It is visible from the street if you look for it, sitting peacefully on its concrete pad, a monument to common sense and reasonable governance. And every day, it reminds me that sometimes the most important battles are fought over the smallest things, because principles matter regardless of scale. Pleasant Grove is now the kind of community I always wanted it to be, a place where neighbors look out for each other, where the HOA serves rather than rules, and where a heat pump can just be a heat pump without becoming a political statement. But I kept that sign in my garage, just in case. Because you never know when you might need to make something a neighborhood talking point again.